White Lotus Rebellion. In some parts of China, the Qing were disliked as foreign conquerors and were suspected of sympathy with the Europeans. In 1794, the White Lotus Rebellion, partly inspired by a messianic ideology that predicted the restoration of the Chinese Ming Dynasty and the coming of the Buddha, raged across central China and was not suppressed until 1804. It initiated a series of internal conflicts that continued through the 1800s. Ignited by deepening social instabilities, these movements were sometimes intensified by local ethnic conflicts and by unapproved religions. The ability of some village militias to defend themselves and attack others intensified the conflicts. Though the same techniques proved useful to southern coastal populations attempting to fend off British invasion. The Opium War and its aftermath, 1839 through 1850. Imports from India. Unlike the Ottomans, the Qing knew little about the enormous fortunes being made in the early 1800s by European and American merchants smuggling opium into China. They did not know that silver gained in this illegal trade was helping finance an industrial transformation of England and the United States. Only slowly did Qing officials become aware of British colonies in India that grew and exported opium, and the major naval base at Singapore through which British opium reached East Asia. In 1729, the first Qing law banning opium imports was promulgated. By 1800, however, opium smuggling had swelled the annual import level to as many as 4,000 chests. Though British merchants had pioneered this profitable trade, Chinese merchants likewise profited from distributing the drugs. A price war in the early 1820s, stemming from the competition between British and American importers, raised demand so sharply that as many as 30,000 chests were being imported by the 1830s. Addiction spread to people at all levels of Qing society, including high-ranking officials. The Qing emperor and his officials debated whether to legalize and tax opium or to enforce the existing ban more strictly. Having decided to root out the use and importation of opium, in 1839 they sent a high official to Canton to deal with the matter. Military weakness. Opium War. War between Britain and the Qing Empire that was, in the British view, occasioned by the Qing government's refusal to permit the importation of opium into its territories. The victorious British imposed the one-sided Treaty of Nanking on China. Britain considered the ban on opium importation an intolerable limitation on trade, a direct threat to Britain's economic health, and a cause for war. British naval and marine forces arrived on the South China coast in late 1839. The Opium War, 1839 through 1842, broke out when negotiations between the Qing officials and British representatives reached a stalemate. The war exposed the fact that the traditional hereditary soldiers of the Qing Empire, the bannermen, were, like the Janissaries of the Ottoman Empire, hopelessly obsolete. As in the Crimean War, the British excelled at sea, where they deployed superior technology. British ships landed Marines who pillaged coastal cities and then sailed to new destinations. The Qing had no imperial navy. Until they were able to engage the British in prolonged fighting on land, they were unable to defend themselves against British attacks. Even in the land engagements, Qing resources proved woefully inadequate. The British could quickly transport their forces by sea along the coast, whereas Qing troops moved primarily on foot, Moving Qing reinforcements from central to eastern China took more than 3 months, and when the defense forces arrived, they were exhausted and basically without weapons. Bannermen, hereditary military servants of the Qing Empire, in large part descendants of peoples of various origins who had fought for the founders of the empire. The bannermen used the few muskets of the Qing had imported during the 1700s. The weapons were matchlocks, which required the soldiers to ignite the load of gunpowder in them by hand. Firing the weapons was dangerous, and the canisters of gunpowder that each musketeer carried on his belt were likely to explode if a fire broke out nearby, a frequent occurrence in encounters with British artillery. Most of the bannermen, however, had no guns at all and fought with swords, knives, spears, and clubs. Soldiers under British command, many of them Indians, carried percussion cap rifles, which were far quicker, safer, and more accurate than the matchlocks. In addition, the long-range British artillery could be moved from place to place and proved deadly in the cities and villages of eastern China. British gunboats. Qing commanders thought that British gunboats rode so slow in the water that they could not sail up the Chinese rivers, so they evacuated the coastal areas to encounter the British threat. But the British deployed new gunboats for shallow waters and moved without difficulty up the Yangtze River. Most favored nation. Treaty of Nanking, the treaty that concluded the Opium War. It awarded Britain a large indemnity from the Qing Empire, denied the Qing government tariff control over some of its own borders, opened additional ports of residence to Britons, and ceded the island of Hong Kong to Britain. Treaty ports. Cities open to foreign residents had a result of the forced treaties between the Qing Empire and foreign signatories. In the treaty ports, foreigners enjoyed extraordinary extraterritorial. Those are treaty ports. The most favored nation status, a clause in a commercial treaty that awards to any later signatories all that privileges previously granted to the original signatories. When the invaders approached in Nanjing, the former Ming capital, the Qing decided to negotiate. In 1842, the terms of the Treaty of Nanjing, the British name for Nanjing, dismantled the old canton system. The number of treaty ports, cities open to foreign residents, increased from 1 canton to 5, Canton, Xiamen, Fuzhou, Ningbo, Shanghai. The island of Hong Kong became a British colony, and British residents in China gained extraterritorial rights. The Qing government agreed to set a low tariff of 5% on imports and on pay Britain an indemnity of 21 million ounces of silver as a penalty for having started the war. A supplementary treaty the following year guaranteed most favored nation status to Britain. Any privileges that China granted to another country would be automatically extended to Britain as well. This provision effectively prevented the colonization of China because giving the land to one country would have necessitated giving it to all. With each round of treaties came a new round of privileges for foreigners. In 1860, a new treaty legalized their right to import opium. Later, French treaties established the rights for foreign missionaries to travel in the Chinese countryside and preach their religion. The number of treaty ports grew, too. By 1900, they numbered more than 90. The treaty system and the principle of extraterritoriality resulted in the colonization of small pockets of Qing territory, where foreign merchants lived at ease. Greater territorial losses resulted when outlying regions gained independence or were ceded to neighboring countries. Districts north and south of the Amur Sea and the northeast fell to Russia by treaty in 1858 and 1860. Parts of modern Kazakhstan and Kyrgyzstan, in the northwest met the same fate in 1864. From 1865 onward, the British gradually gained control of territories on the China's Indian frontier. In the late 1800s, France forced the court of Vietnam to end its tribute relationship to the Qing, while Britain encouraged Tibetan independence. In Canton, Shanghai, and the coastal cities, Europeans and Americans maintained offices and factories that employed local Chinese as menial laborers, and foreigners built comfortable housing in zones where Chinese were not permitted to live, and they entertained themselves in exclusive restaurants and bars. Around the foreign establishments, gambling and prostitution offered employment to part of the local urban population. European zones. Whether in town or in the countryside, Christian missionaries whose congregations sponsored hospitals, shelters, and soup kitchens, or gave stipends to Chinese who attended church, enjoyed a good reputation. But just as often as the missionaries themselves were regarded as another evil, they seemed to subvert Confucian beliefs by condemning ancestor worship, pressuring poor families to put their children into orphanages, or fulminating against foot binding. The growing numbers of foreigners and their growing privileges became targets of resentment for a deeply dissatisfied, daily more impoverished, and increasingly militarized society. The Taiping Rebellion, 1850 through 1864. Taiping Rebellion, a Christian-inspired rural rebellion that threatened to topple the Qing Empire. The inflammatory mixture of social unhappiness and foreign intrusion exploded in the Great Civil War, usually called the Taiping Rebellion. In Guangxi, where the Taiping movement originated and stretched, social problems had been generating disorders for half a century. Agriculture in the region was unstable, and many people had their living from arduous and disliked trades such as disposing of human waste, making charcoal, and mining. Ethnic divisions complicated economic distress. The lowliest trades frequently involved a minority group, the Hakkas, and tensions between them and the majority were rising. Problems may have been intensified by sharp fluctuations in the opium trade and reactions to the cultural and economic impact of the Europeans and Americans in Canton. Young brother of Jesus. Hung Xiuquan, the founder of the Taiping movement, experienced all of these influences. Hung became from a humble Hakka background. After years of study, he competed in the provincial Confucian examinations, hoping for a post in government. He failed the examinations repeatedly, and it appears that he suffered a nervous breakdown in his late 30s. Afterward, he spent some time in Canton, where he met both Chinese and American Protestant missionaries who inspired him with their teachings. Hung had his own interpretation of the Christian message. He saw himself as the younger brother of Jesus, commissioned by God to find a new kingdom on earth and drive the Manchu conquerors, the Qing, out of China. The result would be universal peace. Hung called his new religious movement the Heavenly Kingdom of Great Peace.